Inside of Peterborough Cathedral, there is today an empty grave that contained the coffin and body of a queen. But not just any queen, one who was executed during the Tudor period. On the 8th of February 1587, inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle, Mary, Queen of Scots, walked gracefully into the Great Hall and onto the execution scaffold, where an axeman and his assistant had gathered to take her head from her body. When Mary laid her head onto the block, the first strike of the axe missed her neck and embedded into the back of her head, and then the executioner's second strike was more successful. This landed on Mary's neck, but still it did not separate her head from her body, and the executioner then sawed through the last piece of sinew, keeping this attached. But for months her body then remained inside of the castle, waiting for burial. And Elizabeth I then settled on interring her inside of the nearest cathedral. But Mary was a queen who was buried twice, and she was actually dug up and exhumed from Peterborough Cathedral decades after her death. The funeral procession for Mary, Queen of Scots, occurred on the 30th of June 1587, and her coffin was carried on a chariot, and many people were part of the procession. Mary was, after all, an anointed queen, despite the fact she had been considered a traitor against the English queen, and via torchlight her body was taken from Fotheringhay to Peterborough. The Dean of Peterborough and the bishop performed a brief ceremony, and members of Mary's household staff were also in attendance, but her body was then laid to rest for a short time inside of a vault, whilst the commemorations took place, and specifically this vault, where Mary was buried, was opposite the remains and coffin of another prominent Catholic queen, Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. This burial spot was likely chosen with this in mind, and following her body being lowered into the grave, her household staff broke their ceremonial staves of office and threw them into the grave. Further banquets followed. However, she would be only buried inside of the cathedral for a number of decades. After the death of Elizabeth I, Mary, Queen of Scots' son James became James I of England, and he accepted the offer of uniting the English and Scottish thrones. James was disgusted with his mother's treatment, and with this he planned a huge and elaborate tomb for her to sit at the heart of English worship, Westminster Abbey. He wanted his mother to be buried within the righteous queens and kings of England, including Elizabeth I, and not near to the shunned wife of King Henry VIII. He wanted Mary to be recognised alongside people such as Edward I or Henry VII inside of Westminster Abbey for her role in history. The tomb he had made for her was huge and large and cost a huge amount of money, and was slightly bigger than the tomb he commissioned for Queen Elizabeth I to be buried in, opposite where his mother was to be. But after the completion of the tomb, which was sat on top of a burial vault, the body of Mary was then exhumed from Peterborough Cathedral. The grave diggers dug her up, and they managed to free her coffin, and in 1612 the coffin began its final journey. Mary was embalmed well, and it's likely that minimal decay had set in, as her vault had not been disturbed in the years since her burial inside of Peterborough. The journey from Peterborough for Westminster was long, and there was a grand procession helping her on her way to her final resting place. Mary's body was received in London, and she was then interred inside of the burial vault underneath the huge tomb that had been made for her. But inside of Peterborough Cathedral, the grave where she had been laid to rest in the years following her execution remained empty. During the English Civil War, a tomb which had been made for her was broken up and destroyed as Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarian forces attacked the cathedral and destroyed the monuments devoted to Mary and to Catherine of Aragon. But today this grave is still empty, and a small information plaque marks the site inside of the grand church where the executed Queen of Scotland had been laid to rest. Mary was a queen who was buried twice, and following her execution, her body was treated poorly and she was forced inside of Peterborough to have a Protestant funeral when Mary was very much a devout Catholic. But the empty gravesite of Mary, Queen of Scots, still exists, and it is a remarkable part of her story. Thank you for watching, and as support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.